Hi, in this video we'll be talking about Unit 3, Rhetorical Situation. So we're going to cover some elements of the rhetorical situation, and you should be able to answer these questions by the end of the unit. What is the rhetorical situation? What are the elements relating to the rhetorical situation? What is worldview, bias, and assumption, and why are those things important? So these are the terms that you'll need to know by the end of the unit: rhetorical situation, exigence, subject, context, genre, and also worldview, bias, implicit bias, and assumption. So we're going to start by just talking about what is the rhetorical situation. And when we say rhetorical situation, we are talking about all of the factors or circumstances involved in written communication. That includes both the writer and the reader or the audience. It includes the purpose, the subject, the context, the genre of writing, and it's connected very closely to worldview, bias, and assumptions. So to start with, we consider the writer to be central to the written communication, right? The person who's doing the writing obviously has an important role in what is being written, but so does the audience. We don't necessarily think of that, but the writer really needs to know who his or her audience is in order to be able to meet their needs. It's important, if you are the writer, if you're writing an essay, you need to know who's going to be reading it. Should you use formal or informal language? Should this be a short essay or a long essay? What kind of information? Technical information, lots of evidence, maybe more persuasive. Do you want this to be funny? All of that information, all of those decisions that you make as a writer are at least partly hinging upon who your audience is. If, on the other hand, you are the audience, if you're the one who's reading an essay that someone else has written, it's valuable for you to be able to understand the rhetorical situation. Who is this author? What is their background? What is their expertise and credibility? Why did they write this? So both the writer and the reader play a role in the rhetorical situation. You may have never heard the term exigence before. It's not a very common term, but essentially what it means is what prompted the writer to write this piece of text. What is the origin of it, or the purpose of it? Was there some event or something that happened that caused the writer to feel like this needed to be written? Is it urgent? And if it is, why is it urgent? What is happening in the larger world to make it feel like this is a need right now? Then we discuss subject, which obviously the subject is sort of the issue or the topic that the text is addressing. That is clearly part of the rhetorical situation, as is the context. Context being the larger set of circumstances in which the text sort of exists. What are the social and cultural factors that are happening at this particular time period? What geopolitical circumstances might have prompted this, or what is happening in the world in which this is written? So one way to think about this is to look back at things that have been written in past time periods and to be able to understand that they are an artifact of a particular time period or cultural revolution or a particular social movement in history. So we see things like Victorian literature or Shakespeare's plays. They don't stand alone, right? They have context. They were written during a certain time period in the midst of a certain period in history with certain cultural significance. So that's part of the rhetorical situation. We also want to discuss genre, which essentially is asking what kind of writing this is. Is this like a report, or is it an essay? Which, those are two very different things. Sometimes students don't necessarily distinguish between the two, but a report is different from an essay, which is also different from a story. Obviously, a novel and a tweet or a list or an article, those are all different types of genres. It's also really important when you're discussing the rhetorical significance to be able to address an author's worldview. Worldview is sort of like It's the way in which they view the world. It's a set of beliefs. It's values about their life and the universe and the way that things are supposed to be. So we all have a worldview, right? I have a worldview, you have a worldview, every writer out there and every reader out there has their own worldview, and it impacts what we believe about the world around us. Things like human nature, life and death, equality, relationships, and ethics. But where do we get that worldview? It comes to us, I mean, we're not born with it. It certainly is shaped over time based on our circumstances in life, the experience that we've had. Worldviews can differ based on metrics like gender, race, nationality, religion, wealth, where you live, how your generation, how old you are, what kind of work you do, or your sexual preference. All of those are factors that can impact a person's worldview. So my worldview might be different from your worldview if these factors are different between the two of us. Sometimes being a good critical thinker really requires us to recognize our worldview and be able to look past it. If we rely too much on our worldview, our belief system, then we aren't always able to engage objectively with new ideas, and we tend to fall back into patterns of thinking that may or may not be accurate or innovative, right? As the world changes, we sort of have to change with it, and we have to be willing to engage with new information. We can't just shut something down because it doesn't fit with our existing worldview. So it's important to be able to determine an author's worldview, because that can help us to determine whether or not the information they're providing us is biased or not. Bias and worldview are very closely related. Okay, we all have a worldview, but a worldview tends to be very simplistic. It doesn't explain everything. So you can't always rely on that worldview to give you an answer to everything. But sometimes people do that, right? Our worldview becomes our norm, the way that we look at the world. We don't question it anymore. And if other people have a different worldview than we do, and we aren't willing to try to put ourselves in their shoes and look at the world from their perspective, then that can mean that we are biased, right? That we are not objectively weighing all of the sides of an argument or a topic or an issue. So that's what bias is. It's unfair judgment or an unreasonable point of view that takes a side, essentially. And this can prevent us from being a critical thinker if we allow our worldview and our bias to impact the decisions that we make. Instead of stepping past our worldview, thinking objectively about the topic, and being able to make a logical decision. So when we're reading something, it's important that we know whether the author who's presenting the information, we need to recognize what their worldview is and whether or not they are giving us objective, unbiased information, or whether they are presenting a biased point of view or a one-sided perspective of this topic. That's really important to us as an audience, as a good critical thinker and a reader. We need to know that. So in order to identify bias in a text, there are some things that you can do. First, by understanding the elements of the rhetorical situation, you'll be better able to kind of come up with a plan for whether you think this is biased or objective information. You can also examine the specific language that the author is using. Look for words that are very strongly positive or negative or very emotive, right? Loaded language. Those kinds of things can help you determine whether or not the author is being objective. Objective means like weighing both sides fairly and letting the audience decide, or whether the author is being biased and only presenting a one-sided view of the topic. A lot of times the language that they're using can help you determine whether they're biased or not. It is absolutely worth knowing that bias is implicit, right? It is a preference or an attitude that we hold that is completely unconscious. We don't even know that we have a particular bias in some cases. So it's really important that we understand that not all bias is morally bad, right? Just because you're biased doesn't mean that you're a bad person. But we have to recognize that we have that bias so that we can kind of stop and think more clearly and more carefully about things. If we don't know that we have it, then it will guide our thinking without us even knowing. It will influence our decisions, and we won't even realize that we're being influenced by bias. So please consider taking the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. You can take all different metrics in order to determine where your biases lay. It's a really interesting and eye-opening experience. So just consider that. Finally, the last bit of this chapter involves assumptions. An assumption is when you have a belief about something and you just assume that it's true without looking for any kind of evidence or proof. And sometimes authors make assumptions. They might assume things about their topic that they're writing about. They could assume things about their audience that they don't really know. It's also true that as a reader, you can make assumptions. So you might assume that the author means to say something that they don't really mean. You could assume information about the topic that is or is not true. So it's really important as a critical thinker that you be able to recognize assumptions when they come up. And finally, to end the chapter, we just have a couple of practice activities. The first one here is an example of an assumption. It's a statement. I wrote an essay like this in high school, so I don't need to read the directions. I have absolutely heard students say this to me, and the problem with this statement is that it makes multiple assumptions. It assumes that the instructions are going to be the same, that all essays are alike, that the instructors are looking for the same things in high school and in college. It assumes that the topic you're writing about doesn't need any consideration and that those essays will be identical. It assumes that you remember what those directions said in high school. You know, that's a big assumption. That may not be true. You may not really remember how to do it. And also it assumes that the same amount of work in high school is going to help you be successful in college, which is also perhaps not true. So be careful with statements like this one that are built on assumptions. Another one here is that you can argue all you want about starting the school day later, but that would have devastating consequences on our sports teams. By starting the day later, you also end the day later, and there's only so much after-school practice time available. While that sounds like a reasonable argument on the surface, a good critical thinker will recognize that it is built on several assumptions. We are assuming, first of all, that sports practice is an integral part of the school day. That's not always true in other countries. We do that here in America, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. Secondly, we're assuming that sports practice has to happen after school. Why not give those athletes the time in the morning to practice? It also makes the assumption that what needs to happen for athletes outweighs the benefits that there would be to the entire student body if we changed the school hours. So there are several assumptions that that argument is built on, and if you were going to have a discussion about this topic, it would be important to point those assumptions out before you could move forward with this argument. So guys, that's a discussion of the rhetorical elements. Hopefully at this point you're able to answer these questions and you feel more comfortable with the content. Let me know if you have any questions.